Hi, I'm Remington Aidney Campbell, and this is the History of Musical Theatre podcast interview show. Still need to come up with a better name for it. Today I have Phil Chan here with me. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Phil Chan. I'm the co-founder of Final Bow for Yellowface.
I'm trying to remember where I discovered you on Instagram, probably. Um, but uh, but I know that some of your work was on a ballet called Le Chant de Rossignol. My French is like so, but it's better than my Russian. I've learned this last season. Can you tell me a little bit about that ballet and how you came to it?
Sure. So I actually detailed this process in my first book called Final Bow for Yellowface, Dancing Between Intention and Impact. And the second half of my book follows the conversation around Le Chant de Rossignol. I was invited by the artistic director of Ballet West, Adam Skloot, back in 2019 to help with the presentation of a lost Ballet Russe work. It was a piece that George Balanchine had choreographed. It was his first commission for the Ballet Russe, so significant. And the collaborators were Henri Matisse, who did the sets and costumes, and Igor Stravinsky, who would later on become a very influential collaborator in Balanchine's life. So I think there
Kind
was a
of a
lot of
dream team.
interest. Yeah, I think there was a lot of interest in just in general for folks to see what this work was all about. And it was from 1925, and it detailed the story of the Hans Christian Andersen story about a Chinese emperor who falls sick, and he's given a gift of a fake nightingale by the neighboring Japanese emperor, and he sort of uh, is entranced by the fake nightingale, technology, and actually avoids the real nightingale, who has a beautiful song throughout the kingdom. And in the middle of the night, death comes to take the emperor, and the real nightingale comes and uh, basically saves the emperor from death with her song, and is killed in the process. And at the end of the ballet, the king is restored to his health, and the kingdom is united again. So it's this beautiful allegory of a warning, really, essentially, of saying, hey, don't put too much faith in technology and the flashy things that are sometimes presented to us, but really make sure to stay focused on the real human connections, the community that you're a part of, and that's where the real magic is. So it's a beautiful story. Of course, it was from the 1920s, and the original cast performed it actually in literal yellow face, so painted their faces yellow. And so the dynamic of the book was really sort of almost pitting my perspective against those of the historians who are recreating the work, who felt like we needed to have a accurate time capsule approach, that we needed to see the work exactly the way it was done in 1924, despite the fact that none of the choreography exists. So even the recreation was a product of the historian's imagination for the most part. And then my perspective, which was saying, hey, when we're presenting this work for a multiracial audience, which includes people of Asian descent, we can't just assume that, oh, well, sorry if you're offended, you just have to, suck it up and bear it, and just take it at face value, literally at face value. When for those of us who are Asian and who are used to living with these caricatures, it's sort of not something that we can just go along with and enjoy. Just don't worry about the racism, just enjoy the show, right? So
Yeah.
it was the second half of my book is really navigating that tension of essentially asking what happens when a Eurocentric work, work that sees the world from exclusively a European point of view,
Yeah.
comes in conflict with the real lived experiences of people who are non-European. So the
Yeah.
fantasy in a lot of our repertory versus the reality, the real cultures that people like me come from. So that was really sort of the tension in the second half of my book, and I won't give away the ending. You'll have to read it for yourself. But I try to outline a guide for other creatives who are interested in, reviving, staging work from the past that do have artistic merit, but might have some racially problematic elements, about how to move forward.
And it's interesting because I don't think that there's any historian who'd be like, and in order to recreate it accurately, we need to have lower technical standards for the dancers, or let's just do lighting that's worse. Like, there's lots of things that you
Right.
wouldn't carry over.
Right. Literally gaslighting.
I mean, that's true. I remember hearing something about there there was discussions about when they used gaslights in theaters about dipping the costumes in like a flame retardant in order to not have the dancers catch fire on stage, and they're all like, "No, I don't like the
Yeah.
color."
Yeah, it actually ruined the lightness of the skirts, and so the dancers would rather have the non-treated skirts and risk catching on fire than catch
I'd
on
rather
fire.
burn to death than wear a not
Right.
pretty
You know, and actually
skirt.
there were quite a few young ladies who came to an unfortunate demise when their costumes would catch on fire and they were too demure to take off their costumes, or they would rather be embarrassed than than show their naked bodies.
Oh.
Yeah, the things we do to protect our chastity.
Literally burned to death. Yeah. So that's I mean, I definitely agree with the thing about a lot of these works do have some really great artistic merit. I love a lot of Nikia's stuff in La Bayadere. It's like really different from what you see in a lot of classical ballet. It's like
Now, why do you think that is?
um it's it's less jumpy. I'm going to use all kinds of non-technical language about this. It's it feels so controlled, and I'm thinking especially about her entrance where she does these like three very slow lunges, like getting deeper and deeper and deeper. It's it struck me as really different. I
Yeah,
don't.
so you wouldn't see a European character dancing that way, do you feel?
Well, it's not that I can't imagine a European character dancing that way. It's that I haven't seen it.
Yeah. So actually, this is the thesis of my next book, which I'm working on right now, which is I looked at about 100 Orientalist ballets from 1700 to today. So I got a New York Public Library fellowship. So during 2020, I was locked inside just reading ballet books all day. Um,
I can think
and
of worse
essentially,
ways to spend that year.
really, there a lot of people had worse years than me, but. What I'm finding is that really Orientalism is the greatest driver of creativity and innovation in the Western performing arts. So when you think about it, when you say you haven't seen Europeans move like that before, that really is part of the appeal. It was saying, well, we don't really know how those Oriental people dance. We don't really know about their culture. So we have some information because we have some texts and some accounts of missionaries, and we have porcelain objects. So we sort of have a vague idea, but we don't really know because I've never met anyone from that place before. So I guess if we Europeans point our feet, maybe you Orientals flex your feet, or you're more grounded.
Yeah.
We do the minuet and the polka and the waltz, so 3/4 4/4 time. So I guess maybe you Orientals, let's just add an extra beat, 5/4. And then the next generation of artists comes along, and saying, oh, flex feet, let's just make that part of the vocabulary. Let's not make it coded as exotic. And then even
Yeah.
5/4 time signature, like Stravinsky, mentioning Stravinsky, he used all sorts of crazy time signatures, and then it became just music. So even if you think about Dave Brubeck, take five. Da, 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 that's jazz, right?
Yeah.
That's a 5/4 time signature, which otherwise would have been coded as an exotic time signature. But now we just think of it as just music, it's just jazz. So Orientalism was a way to explore things outside of the norm. So even things like sex, drugs, rock and roll, like, oh, well, we don't have orgies here in Europe, right? There's no orgies in Sleeping Beauty or Swan Lake. But Scheherazade, Samson and
Yeah. I feel
Delilah,
like checking one of
harems, slave
these.
girls, yeah, all sorts of kinky stuff happens in the Orient, right?
Yeah.
um, and so it was a way to explore sides of humanity that maybe weren't proper in Europe, right?
Yeah.
So people who are borderline savage, would do extreme things like throw themselves off of, into a burning fire pit, when actually the reality is they were too scared to take off their tutus that were on fire. So it began like a different kind of crazy thing. But so that's really what Orientalism has been. And so
Hmm.
that worked when everybody was European, when everyone was white, when everyone just saw the world from Europe's perspective.
Yeah.
But now, in places that are quickly diversifying, the United States, Australia,
Oh,
parts
yeah.
of Europe, we're all people from different places. We have lots of different cultures. We're a multiracial society, and so we can't just look at the world and say, "Oh, well, this is how Petipas thought Indian people looked like," and too bad if you're offended. We also have to consider, what about Indian people who have their own perspective on their culture? How do they view this work as well? So it's being forced to look at the way we do things from multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
So in the case of Bayadere, as a creative artist, I'm also asking, okay, what else could it be? So I agree with you. I think Bayadere is a beautiful piece. It has artistic merit. It's has beautiful music, beautiful passages of dancing. And as a choreographer who's looking forward, who's interested in innovating the art form and pushing dance into the future, I feel like we need a strong grasp of where we came from in order to know where we're going, right? So I don't think that we can just say, well, Bayadere is inherently racist and colonialist, and we need to get rid of it and have an Asian choreographer make a new work, right? That's sort of cancel culture. That's not what I prescribe to. Instead, I'm thinking, well, what else could it be? And when you're like a little kid and like you have a pencil, and the pencil could be a magic wand or a sword or a
Yeah.
spaceship or a spoon, or it just could be anything. You have to use that same creative approach when you're looking at works from the performing arts canon that might have some outdated ideas of race.
Yeah.
So in Bayadere, for example, out pops this bronze idol, and he's doing these sort of fake mudras, and kind of it's sort of pretending to be like a Hindu god, which already is touching on someone else's religion. It's kind of icky, but not in any sort of context that is appropriate for Indian people.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that dance? What do we do with that number in Bayadere? There's also a lot of blackface in the ballet as well. So I don't think that we can necessarily just say, well, let's do it the way Petipa did it.
Yeah.
Because look at Shakespeare, for example. We've done 400 plus years of Shakespeare as a society, and boy, I mean, any of your listeners will know we've probably all seen a Shakespearean play that took place outside of the original context.
Oh,
So
I'm doing a
a Midsummer
Shakespearean
Night's Dream
play.
set in modern day time, or The Tempest set in the
We
1950s,
open
or
tonight of A Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's a musical and it's
right.
contemporary. Like,
Exactly. So we're okay doing that with Shakespeare.
yeah.
So what would it look like in ballet? So I'm working on a production of La Bayadere, which will premiere in 2024, and it asks that question: what else could it be? So I'm going back to the old Justement and Stepanov notation. So the notes we have that detail the choreography, and I'm working with the brilliant musicologist Doug Fullington, who's also a notation expert, as well as Carla Corbis, who is a principal dancer with Pacific Northwest Ballet, so gorgeous coach as well. And we're going back to the notation, and we're restaging La Bayadere, but we're questioning that European center. So originally it's a story, it's a melodrama, it's about a temple dancer who is in love with a noble warrior who's betrothed to a princess. So there's this sort of class dynamic, but the sort of this love triangle, melodramatic love triangle. So what else could it be? What else could the story be besides being the sort of Indian pastiche fantasy? So our production retains the steps and the music, but it's set during the 1930s, so like the golden age of Hollywood musicals. And our cast is making a cowboy musical. So they're at a ranch and they're shooting a film. So there's a camera crew around, and they're all pretending to be cowboys. So if you've seen Singing in the Rain, I know you're a musical theater dork. Imagine Debbie Reynolds is Nakia,
Yeah.
Solar is Gene Kelly, and Lena Lamont. I can't stand him. That's Princess Gamzati, and you can keep the story, you can keep the choreography, you can keep the music, But instead of it being a fantasy about those Indian people over there, it becomes a fantasy about us. And you
Yeah.
don't have to change the makeup because everybody can be a cowboy. You know, there were Indian cowboys, Chinese cowboys, black cowboys, Mexican cowboys, Native American cowboys, white cowboys, everybody was a cowboy. So that's a great multiracial fantasy to graft onto this masterpiece.
That's so cool, and it gets to keep that element of like a fantasy faraway place, but it's set somewhere non-offensive. Like it's fantastical because it's in the past,
Right. I mean, and
not
that's
because
another thing
it's
is,
other people.
right. And my book actually questions that. Like, what are multiracial fantasy places? When once upon a time in a kingdom far, far away, if there are actually people from that kingdom far, far away, then what's exotic anymore? So time periods, different times are exotic, right? Like the
Yeah,
1920s are exotic to people, to us today, right? The 1500s are exotic to people today. The future, split space is exotic for people
the
today. Star
buyer
Trek,
there
Star
is
Wars,
space.
right? Yeah, like Star Wars is an exotic place to us. So,
Yeah,
and then that's a multiracial fantasy that, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, what culture you come from. Star Wars is an exotic place
yeah,
for all of us. You can be black, you can be Chinese, you can be Mexican. Star Wars is exotic. So
because
that
none
that
of us
that's
actually come from a galaxy
right.
far, far away.
Right. So it's sort of like questioning things like mermaids and fairies. Um, mermaids can't get offended because
No,
they're not real, whereas Chinese people who are real, we can get offended.
they
So
are
we're not
real.
right. So that's the question is like, how do we find fantasy places, fantasy characters, fantasy stories that are exotic to everybody, not just to
Yeah,
Europeans?
that's it. I feel like Nikia has a mermaid-like quality about her. And
Maybe your production of La Bayadere takes place under the sea.
it's the Little
Who,
Mermaid, but I just
who
stole
makes the
all the
rules? Yeah,
choreography.
who makes the rules?
And then the other big, you've worked on a lot of things, but one of the big things you've worked on is on the Nutcracker, on particularly on the Chinese dance or the tea dance. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I received a call in 2017 from the artistic director of New York City Ballet, Peter Martins. He had been given my phone number by my good friend Georgina Pazgogan, who's the first Asian woman to make it out of the corps de ballet at New York City Ballet. So they're
And who
still
wrote a
there.
great book. I read it
Right.
in about a day.
Swan Dive is excellent. Make sure to check it out if you want a sort of unvarnished view of what goes on behind the scenes at a ballet company. Um, and Peter called me because he was sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, he felt like it wasn't his responsibility to change a masterpiece by the previous ballet master, despite the fact that we've always been doing that in ballet. Like every ballet master ever has done that job, but he didn't feel comfortable doing that for Nutcracker. Um, I think maybe because Balanchine's Nutcracker has such a strong emotional pull and so many companies do it. So it's just such a big entity.
Yeah.
At the same time, he couldn't ignore the growing tide of letters that the company had received, literally, numbering in the thousands over the years, of people saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with how the different cultures, the different ethnicities are portrayed, and I'm not comfortable bringing my kids to the Nutcracker anymore. And when you're losing kids for the Nutcracker, you're in trouble. So he wanted my opinion to see how the dance impacted somebody like me, somebody who experienced the world in my skin with the last name Chan and with my face looking the way it does. Um, and he also wanted someone who really knew the choreography and was a dancer and could speak to the artistic legacy as well.
Yeah.
And so we looked at the history of the Nutcracker, the history of that production, but also the history of how Asian people have been portrayed on our stages and media. So looking at political commentary, radio, television, film, early immigration propaganda, just to see what were images of Asianness in the water. And in America we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, but I think in Australia you had an Australia First policy, which was
Yeah, the White
actually
Australia policy. Yeah.
right, which was set out to discriminate against Chinese people from moving to Australia. So there is this history of codified discrimination
Yeah.
in our countries. And so looking at that history and then looking and saying, okay, and this is the art we're putting on stage. You know, what's the connection there? And so after that conversation, um, I made small changes to the makeup, the choreography, and the costuming. And really the line was I was trying to get him to swing the dance from caricature into character.
Yeah.
So the difference between those two things, so caricatures are flat, they're two-dimensional, they're sort of shorthand, they're the butt of the joke, slapstick. Whereas a character is more nuanced, it's fleshed out, it's three-dimensional. You build empathy for a character, right? And so how do we make it so the Chinese caricature turns into a Chinese character?
Yeah.
And so I left that meeting and I called Gina and I said, you know, Gina, I think Peter Martins is going to change the Nutcracker. And we realized in that moment that we had this unique opportunity. We could either just say, well, you know, good job, New York City Ballet. We both have busy lives. Let's go back to it. Like we both have friends and family and jobs and stuff. But we looked around at the rest of the landscape and we realized so many other ballet companies were still doing these caricatured Yellowface things. So, you know, we're saying on one side of our mouth, yes, you know, people of color, non-white people, please come in, join our board, drop your kids off at our schools, you know, buy tickets to our season. But then here's this hoochie coochie version of your heritage from 200 years ago. Like that doesn't work that way. So, you know, we're both ballet insiders. We both are lifelong ballet dancers and we love it as an art form. And so we thought, how do we get the ballet world to shift into swinging, you know, caricature into character? How do we get everybody to do it and do better, especially if we want people like us to feel included in the room? And so we bought yellowface.org and we put up a pledge that essentially says, I love ballet, and because I'm committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion, I'm going to eliminate Yellowface on our stages. And we realized that we didn't actually have to get everybody in the known universe to commit to not doing Yellowface anymore. We just had to change the standard amongst the best companies in America. And then we would see a trickle down effect, hopefully, throughout the world. And so we just quietly went around to the companies we knew saying, hey, I know it's February. Nobody wants to talk about Nutcracker right now. But just to let you know, this is a problem, and we're going to talk about it. And come next September, November, December, we're going to be having a real substantial conversation. So you have time now to raise money if you need new costumes, if you need to tweak the choreography, get permissions, run this by your board, run this by the original choreographer. You have 11 months to do so.
That's much better than trying to do that in October and be like, hey, you should change this.
Right. It's also not realistic, right? So we gave folks a full, you know, almost a year to get it right. And then the following year in 2018, we did a full press offensive and you know, started talking to all of the newspapers and pretty much at this point, you know, we celebrated our 5th anniversary this year. And at this point, pretty much every major American ballet company has signed the pledge. A lot of the big international companies have signed as well, like the National Ballet of Canada, the UK's Royal Ballet, Scottish Ballet, even David Hallberg and the previous artistic director, David McAllister of the Australian Ballet, have both signaled their support for this work. So I think it's, like I said, it's really important for any ballet company that serves a multiracial audience to really have this conversation.
Yeah. I had a train of thought. What I've seen you talk a little bit recently about things that are happening in opera, in other mediums where it's a costume tweak doesn't do the whole job. Our ballet company may have signed your pledge, but our opera company, I know, drew some ire recently.
Yeah, so let's talk about Opera Australia. Let's talk about the situation. So I firmly believe that there are ways to do works like Madame Butterfly and Turandot in a respectful way, and that if you have a director who is not as sensitive on this issue, you can have productions of those operas with really poor choices. So I don't think the works themselves are inherently racist in any way, but I do think that in the hands of somebody who makes insensitive choices, that's the impact that it can have on audiences. And we see that that was indeed the impact it had on many members of the Asian community in Australia in response to that production. Um, you have to do it in Yellowface. It's actually more work to do the makeup like that than just to do them
Yeah.
as, you know, normal people. So, but yeah, the opera world has been also slow to embrace this conversation. But in recent years, actually, just in the last 6 months or so, the Asian Opera Alliance has just launched here in the United States. It's a collective of Asian American opera singers and growingly international opera singers of Asian descent who are pushing back against not only some of the stereotypes on stage, but also some of the pigeonholing that happens off stage. So
Yeah.
I recently did a conversation with them, and there were about 30 members of the Asian Opera Alliance on this call. And I said, you know, it'd be great for us to go around and everyone can introduce each other. And they all laughed and they said, Phil, we all know each other because we've all done Madame Butterfly together. See, I've done 4 Madame Butterflies with Steve in Austin. I did a Madame Butterfly with June in Tulsa. I've done 4 with Nikki in San Francisco, you know, like, and so they were pigeonholed into singing just those roles so much so
Yeah.
that the community had sprouted up, you know, amongst them, as opposed to being, you know, if you're singing Don Giovanni this week and Carmen the next week, and you might not meet the same people over and over again, but with
Yeah.
Asian singers, you do. So, and of course, there's other folks in other mediums who are doing this work. The Coalition of Asians and Pacifics in Entertainment, CAPE in Los Angeles, has been doing this work for over 40 years in film and television. I know that in the Theater Communications Group and other theater-based organizations are also questioning some of these things on the Broadway stage. And even, you know, since you're a Broadway dork, I was working with New York City Center on a production for Encores, which is their sort of revival for a production of Thoroughly Modern Millie, which of
Yes.
course
Yeah.
includes Mrs. Mears' character, which is sort of like this creepy lady who's pretending to be Chinese, and that's sort of like the plot twist, that she's like selling white girls into white slavery, and you know the whole plot kind of hinges around that. So we were actually working with Lauren Yee, who's an incredible Asian American playwright, to reimagine what that character could be. And so it was originally slated to be Taylor Mack playing Mr. Mears, sort of a creepy version of that. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, we had to you know, cancel that production. So I'm still curious to see what will actually happen with Thoroughly Modern Millie, but I've also worked on productions of Anything Goes,
Yeah.
which again, that's the sort of ching chang chong plot line, you know, at the end, where it's like, oh, we're all in Yellowface, and that's why there's a misunderstanding, and that's why it's the whole plot kind of revolves around this Yellowface moment. So I really like finding creative solutions to avoid canceling some of these works that are great,
Yeah.
but just have like a problematic moment or a problematic character, or and it always goes back to this question of what else could it be.
Mm. I, I I definitely have noticed that 20s and 30s works are such culprits in that. In musical theater, they're the ones that we, I love Anything Goes and Thoroughly Modern Millie. I don't know if you know the show Dames at Sea. Like a little version of it, of a big tap musical, which also includes in it a song called Singapore Sue, which is like for no reason. The guy's like, yeah, I've been writing a song for a musical. Here it is, and
Right.
it and it's that same sort of.
I mean, but it's not just the 20s, even in Cats, you know, Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats, there's a song about the Siamese cats, you know, that they don't do anymore. You know, and it's not just the 1920s, it's the 1820s, it's the 1720s, and all the other years in between. I mean, we've been doing this for, you know, almost 400 years. And my research will show that we've literally been doing these Asian fantasies since the Baroque era, and, you know, even before that. So these
I
fantasies
guess the 20s are
of,
just the ones we still do in musical theater.
right, you know what I mean? Like, you know, I do have to admit, since this is a musical theater, um, I have to admit that The Mikado is like probably hands down my favorite Gilbert and Sullivan. But again,
That's
it's,
that's difficult.
yeah, it is difficult. I think it has the best music. I think Sullivan really outdid himself in terms of the lushness of the music. Of course, it's not Japanese, but I think it's beautiful music. The lyrics are so witty. Of course, if you you know, change some of the off-color language that is from that period. The N-word makes an appearance a couple times. But overall, I do think it's very funny. But I think that if it's in the hands of somebody who lacks creativity and imagination, the
Yeah.
Mikado can be quite an offensive work. And if you don't understand the point of the Mikado, you can use it to punch down at Japanese people, which is not what it's about. It's about punching up at British people, not punching down at Japanese people. So if I were going to do a production of the Mikado, I would flip this dynamic around and say, okay, well, what if there were Japanese people who had never been to this fantasy kingdom of England, and we only have a little bit of information about those English people. There's Queen Elizabeth. They wear tartan. They have those big funny hats. All the policemen have those hats.
Kilts plus beefeater hats.
They boil all their food. And you know how sometimes you see people, putting chopsticks in their hair. So I guess people in England put forks and maybe a big, ladle in their hair, other cooking utensils in their hair. I don't really know because I've never been to England, but that's what I assume the English people dress like. So what if you centered, instead of Europe's view of Japan, what if you flipped it and said, let's pretend we're Japanese who've never seen English people before? What would that Mikado look like?
I'm looking forward to a rise in Occidentalist works.
Yes, absolutely. So there was a play called Soft Power by David Henry Hwang that premiered at the Public Theater right before COVID in 2019. And I wrote about it in my book as well. And basically it follows the playwright, a fictional version of the playwright, David Henry Hwang, who's commissioned by the Chinese government to create an American style musical. And it's about Hillary Clinton, and so it's a Hillary Clinton musical, but it's seen from the perspective of Chinese people. So, Hillary Clinton flies into New York City and there's the Golden Gate Bridge in the background, because even though the Golden Gate Bridge is in San Francisco, it doesn't matter, it's all the same, it's all America.
You get it in the shot.
Right. And everybody has a gun and there's tap dancing French fries. And, it's a parody of these fantasies that we have of other cultures. And of course, it's an all Asian cast in whiteface. So they have blonde wigs on, and their skin is painted white and they're pretending to be California people, and it really, in flipping it, it just shows you how absurd the ping pong pong is of Turandot and the idea that we have this dynamic. When we see it making fun of ourselves, we go, oh, shit.
I mean,
what I mean? And that's what I think there is power in doing things like that. I mean, the Mikado could also be one of those works that gets you to think like that, flip it around and suddenly you go, oh, shit. And it's funny.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen occasionally with Australia, you get these like weird stereotypes. I mean, there's a national custom that we actually do have, which is convincing foreigners that drop bears are real. Drop bears are just evil koalas.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, that can smell foreigners and.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because we're the land of like crocodile hunters and.
Of course.
And everything's trying to kill you.
I wrote in my book about what is exotic today, and I do touch on a chapter about, there's a review, an all-male review in Las Vegas called Thunder Down Under, and it has supposedly these Aussie hunks taking off their clothes and doing lap dances and stuff, and I'm just thinking, wow, it's because we can't use exotic people anymore. What's exotic to us Americans? I guess Australian hunks that's exotic for us, I
mean, we do export a lot of buff guys. Like
right,
that's one of our main exports.
Right, but that is, if you think about what's exotic, I guess that's it. Compared to, say, a male go-go dancer from Los Angeles or Montana or Idaho. It's like that's not really as exciting as, oh, this man's from Australia. And actually I did check the requirements. You have to be of Australian or New Zealand citizenship in order to work there. So while it is exotic, they are authentically Australian hunks.
And Kiwis.
And Kiwis, yes.
Yeah.
But it's all the same. It doesn't matter. Chinese, Japanese, whatever, right?
There's a going a thing that often happens, which is that Australia and New Zealand are totally different unless someone from New Zealand becomes famous, in which case they're Australian.
Right.
Yeah, that's how it works. Just
Yeah.
if you needed, just
Right.
in
Of
case you
course.
came across any famous Kiwis, they're actually Australian. Just saying.
Got it. Good to know.
And they have weird accents, but ours are fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like it's similarly, Chinese, Japanese, like it
Yeah,
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Chinese, Japanese, who cares? Kiwi, Aussie, it doesn't matter, right? They're just people over there.
it is interesting. I have a friend in this show I'm doing at the moment, who actually I told her I was interviewing you, and she thought that was very cool. But realizing that there's that being uh, living in Malaysia and being of Chinese descent is different than being living in Malaysia and being of Malaysian descent. Like the I know it must sound so obvious, but that um, you retain nationality through generations in a way that I think, as a white person, I don't. I mean, I guess I'm British, but
Well, British criminal.
excuse me, my family came here via Africa actually as
Right.
missionaries
Right.
and doctors. So
Exactly. But again, that is the assumption, right? That is
yeah,
the that is another story that we tell ourselves that's in the ecosystem that
yeah,
we keep challenging. So yeah, like your friend was saying, you know, the difference between being a member of the majority versus the member of the minority is very different. And we see that in this Yellowface conversation as well. So people in China, where everybody is Chinese, the center is Chinese.
yeah,
You have Chinese good guys and Chinese bad guys, and fat Chinese people and skinny Chinese people, and crazy rich Asians and poor Asians, and everybody in between. So there's a lot of
yeah,
nuance, and different characters. Whereas when you're in the minority, the world is structured around somebody else's experience.
yeah,
So you as the Asian person, if you're a small minority, you might only get the one exchange student character, or the one stereotype. And so when Chinese people or people in Asia come across Yellowface, they just say, well, I don't understand. It's just a clown. Like, why are you offended? It's just like there's
yeah,
there's like a Chinese clown. Like that's we have Chinese clowns. How can you be offended by that?
yeah,
But it's like, no, you don't understand. That's the only version of our culture, is we're always the stupid chink. That's a slur, my word. That stupid clown. We're
yeah,
always that character. We're always the geisha, right? We're
yeah,
always the dragon lady. And so, in Asia, that would just be one of many myriad of characters.
yeah,
Whereas in the West, when we're in the minority, it's a small sliver. So I think that's why, this conversation for people who are living in the minority,
yeah,
it packs a punch. And especially if you're looking at what's happening with COVID and the sort of anti-Asian response we're seeing everywhere, the uptick in violence and xenophobia against people of Asian descent, that comes because we don't see each other with nuance and
yeah,
humanity, right? The only images you have of Asian people are caricatured Yellowface. When somebody says, haha, kung flu, you're like, yeah, haha, kung flu, right? Like it doesn't register. But
yeah,
if you actually know Chinese people and say, no, no, wait, I have Chinese family members. I have a Chinese person in my school. I've got a Chinese coworker. I don't subscribe to that.
yeah,
When you see us with nuance, it's impossible to live with those caricatures and those stereotypes. So that's really what our work is pushing for, and it's saying, the choices we make on stage, how we portray people on stage, there are lived consequences for people who look like that outside. And we also see this with women. The stories we tell ourselves over and over with women, and what women are allowed to do, and the power that women have in our stories, versus when women write their own stories and write their own characters. We start to see a real difference in the level of depth and the way we can identify with these characters. So that's the shift we're asking for, and hopefully that's the shift that a lot of these performing arts organizations will question, because The flip side of this equation is saying, well, where are the Asian artists telling our own stories,
Yeah.
right? You do Bayadere, you do Bugaku, you do Miraculous Mandarin, you do Le Corsaire every season. Yet, how many choreographers of Asian descent have you hired? How many musicals by an Asian composer have you ever staged? Right?
I can
Yet,
only think of one.
right. So you can probably name a whole bunch of Asian characters or musicals and ballets and plays that take place in Asia, but
Yeah.
not by Asian artists. So whose story are we centering? Whose experience of Asianness do we keep perpetuating? So we're actually launching sort of the evolution of Final Bow for Yellowface. We're calling it the Gold Standard Arts Foundation. And I'm working with a few other leaders of Asian descent to counter program some of these fantasies. So we're working with 10 American dance companies to commission new Asian works by 2025. So Asian choreographer, composer, lighting designer, set designer, costume designer, really telling our own stories,
Yeah.
not as a fantasy, but just saying this is an expression of who we are in our culture. So it's my hope that we can avoid some of the Orientalism and actually empower Asian people to tell our own stories.
Yeah. And that's really important for that sort of first stage commission, because it certainly seems like a lot of ballet companies, their bread and butter are these massive full length narrative ballets, but obviously you're not going to ask someone to create a full length narrative ballet as the first thing you've ever seen them do.
Right.
And so it's, if you don't have opportunities here, you're never going to have opportunities here, which is where
Right. But also full length ballets, like the Tsar is dead. Like who's paying, right? No, but like who's paying for this opulent spectacle that
yeah.
is so expensive that has one particular narrow worldview? Like I mean, we've moved on from that. That is the way we did ballet in the 19th century, but the 20th century has moved on from that. And so why are we not making work for VR? Why are we not making work for, you know, people in the street today, not for the Tsar? Like, why are we
Yeah.
still doing Swan Lake as if, the King of France is going to pay for it and is in the audience? What about people like you and me who are not royal? Like,
Yeah.
how do we make ballet relevant and urgent and meaningful to us? Otherwise it's just a time capsule
Really
experience. It's like, oh,
expensive
like
time
it's a history
capsule.
experiment, right? Like, and like, who cares if it won't make you feel anything? It's like,
Yeah.
it just, you're like, oh, okay, that's how they did it 200 years ago. Cool. But like, will it make you cry? Will it make you reflect on your relationship with your parents or your lover? Will it show you a new truth about yourself that you didn't want to confront, but that now you're forced to? Ballet can be that,
Yeah.
and it can be urgent and radical, or it could be a cute dance that kings and queens of Europe used to do 400 years ago. So which is it? Which do we want it to be? Which are we going to invest our time and energy and resources, our hard-earned dollars to make true? That's the question that our field needs to answer.
That's that's so interesting. I have always thought of sort of full length narrative ballets. I'm like, that's like the main thing. And I mean, there's some
They didn't they
recent.
didn't do that in the 18th century. They didn't do that in the 20th century, right? Like, what are the best ballets of the 20th century are not full-length ballets, right?
No, they're
Right.
um the
Shorter ones.
Robbins and the Balanchine and
Yeah, shorter ones. But also even during the 19th century, Petipa did a lot of one-act ballets. Tons. He did lots of little duets, lots of little pieces. But we just think, or we only revive the big long ones, that are 4 hours long. But like, he did little dances too. And so it's picking and choosing what from history we want to keep going forward.
the
But
Ballet
we
Russe was mostly one acts.
Right.
I
So
mean,
so
they
what
lost
so
a
who
bunch
said
of
so
money
who
trying
said
to do
that,
Sleeping
yeah, this
Beauty.
idea that ballet is supposed to be 4 hours long and Sleeping Beauty, Swan Lake, and the Nutcracker are the only real ballets? Like, that's a weird 19th
And
century
Giselle,
idea.
there's four ballets.
Right. And Giselle, right. But like, that's a weird, 19th century idea that for some reason 200 years later you're still holding on to, and I can't explain
Yeah.
why.
I I mean, I can't either because I love lots of short ballets.
Right. And I think a lot of artistic directors of ballet companies are still in that mindset. And I don't understand why.
Yeah, I don't know why. Um,
You'll have to ask get David Hallberg on your next podcast and ask him directly.
do you have a number I can call?
I do actually. He's lovely, lovely. You guys are in great hands.
I I mean, he did his rehab out here after getting injured, and that's why he ended up coming out here.
Yep.
We also the Queensland Ballet is run by Lee Swin Sing because we love foreigners running. I mean, David Halberg as well is not Australian.
He's a
Um,
Yank.
pardon?
He's a Yank. He's a Yankee
I
boy.
know he's one of you guys.
Yes, he is.
And Lee Swin Sing came via America as well. So
Well, you know, the Australian Ballet is the only ballet company in Australia that has signed our pledge. So perhaps as a result of this, listening to this podcast, or you spreading the word locally, we might have more signers in Australia join on
yeah,
board.
yeah. I mean, we don't have a ton of ballet companies, so that's
But I'll take it.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. That's so interesting. In terms of different ballets, I know that I love like comedic ballets,
Mhm.
like the concert stuff like that. There's a lot of these short ballets that are just they're fascinating because they're not. It's not Marie Taglioni and La Sylphide.
Yeah, but you know, there's a lot of funny dance out there, you know,
Yeah.
and that's just another human emotion that is present in a lot of our work. So I'm also working on a version of Le Corsaire right now, which is, I think, a wildly funny ballet. It is probably the, you know, if we're talking about ists, racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, it's probably like the most ist of all of the ballets.
It's the
But it is,
easiest ballet.
yes, it's so campy, and it's so over the top, and I have a soft spot for sort of campy romps. But our version of Le Corsaire, in thinking of how to save it, you know, is it even worth saving? That's the question. But in thinking about how to
Can
save it,
you?
yes, well, this is our attempt. So, thinking about what is Le Corsaire at its heart, it's a harem fantasy, right? That's what it is. It's a chance for the men in the audience to go and see this vision of what an Arabian harem might have looked like. And
What if I
what,
had 10 wives?
right, what if I had 10 wives and they were all slaves and they had to do exactly what I said? What's that fantasy look like? So, you know, playing this what else could it be game, you know, that I like to play. So what is a harem in our society today? Where do we see women like that?
I think
So
I've heard about a bit about this, so I know the answer.
well, our version of Le Corsaire takes place at the Miss Ocean's beauty pageant, and it takes place at the Pirates Cove Casino in Atlantis Beach. Atlantis Beach is a fantasy place. It's sort of a little bit like Atlantic City, Las Vegas, Monte Carlo. You know, it's got a lot of casinos, and so
Yeah.
um,
Casino and beach. Two
yeah,
fantasy locations, put them together.
put together, right? And so our version of Le Corsaire, instead of a harem, is at a beauty pageant, and you know, there's a pasha character who's sort of like the sultan, and he of course is very horny because he has a harem of women, and he spends most of the ballet walking around trying to get more women to join his harem. So just kind of a like a dopey, horny Arab dude. And so thinking about what else could it be? Well, what's our version of that guy? So our version of the Sultan or the Pasha is the owner of the casino, the organizer of the beauty pageant, the type of guy who you'd probably see on the receiving end of a Me Too lawsuit. You know, someone who believes that if you're famous enough, you know, women will just let you touch them anywhere. Um, and that character we're actually going to have played by a woman. So a female performer will play that role. And because it's a woman playing the role, she can turn up the sexism and the chauvinism, right?
Yeah.
She can be really disgusting, like a real piggy slob. And we will laugh at him. We will laugh at this organizer who is both so chauvinistic and piggy, but also it holds up a mirror to ourselves to say, hey men, don't be gross. Like, men
Yeah.
in the audience, calling all gentlemen, don't do that. Women don't like that. Don't do it. And so here we have this character who was originally coded as an Arab from 1870, suddenly is a man that we recognize in our society, even ourselves. We might even recognize a bit of that character ourselves, and it becomes really funny, but also deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so suddenly you have this ballet from 1870 that was sexist, now suddenly with a feminist message. And
Yeah.
you're not changing the music and you're not changing the choreography. It's still Le Corsaire.
And
But
it also,
just a twist like that
yeah.
makes the impact on a contemporary audience.
It also just made me think of something that Georgina in her book was talking about with a production of Romeo and Juliet at the New York City Ballet, which I had initially heard about from Catherine Morgan and heard all these great things, and the difference between playing Juliet and playing the nurse clearly is a lot, but having the role played by a man means that you can, sorry, having the role of the man played by a woman um, allows you to have that character do things without actually asking your female performers on stage playing the beauty pageant contestants and stuff to be sexually harassed on stage.
Right, right.
Um,
So they can still do it. They can have fake padding in their bras, and as soon as the male character walks away, they roll their eyes and they pull them out of their bras. Like, oh God, I have to do this stupid thing to please the man, and that's funny, right? You just laugh. That's funny, but it's also like, oh, that's really uncomfortable and like a truth that we're looking at and laughing at, but also we're finally actually looking at it. So there is a way to deal with these things,
yeah.
in a way that questions them, and that doesn't just say, well, that's how we did it last year and the year before that and the year before that, and we can't change it. Sorry.
Yeah. Where are these ballets? Do you know where these ballets are going to be
Yeah,
staged?
Indiana University is taking Le Bayadere in spring of 2024. I'm not ready to announce our Le Corsaire
Okay.
engagement yet, but we
A
have a few
secret
other a
location.
secret location somewhere along the coast of Atlantis Beach,
Somewhere in the world.
somewhere in the known imagined world.
That's thank you so much for talking to me. This has been really, really enjoyable.
My
I
absolute pleasure.
I've never been so questioned by someone I was interviewing before.
Well, that's good. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing my job, right?
I mean, true, true. Um, you've gotta let me know if you ever make it out to this strange exotic fantasy land.
I'll have to watch out for the evil koalas. I hear that's a thing.
Yeah, yeah, drop bears, drop bears.
Yes. Yes.
Um, yeah, and we don't actually ride kangaroos to school. We ride emus. It's just more efficient.
I did realize that the kangaroo pouches are actually covered in mucus, which is not as fun as I would have thought it would have been. So yeah, definitely we'll be staying away from the kangaroos, and also they're not quite as friendly as
Oh
I'd
no,
like
they'll
to.
punch you.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe
Yeah.
I'll just observe from a distance if I do
And
come. But thank you for the invite.
and cassowaries are like an emu crossed with a rhino.
Right,
It's like give an emu a horn
right,
and anger problems.
right.
So we've got those two.
I mean, I'll take it. I'll take it as long as it's not too exotic.
No, no, never too exotic.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much for chatting to me. Have a
Of
really lovely
course.
rest of your evening.
Of course, my pleasure, and good luck with the rest of this work. And I'm so glad that all of you musical theater dorks out there are also starting to think about these issues in a bigger way.
Yeah. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you guys can follow our work at Final Bow for Yellowface on Instagram. You can also check out yellowface.org for more information, as well as a copy of my book, Final Bow for Yellowface, Dancing Between Intention and Impact. It is available in Australia. You guys can get it right on Amazon. So definitely check it out.
Cool. Thank you so much.